Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Pierre Bourdieu, and Jacques Lacan, they became fashionable points of reference throughout the Western literary and academic worlds. Roger Scruton, the conservative British philosopher, refers to a culture of repudiation that challenged the very ideas of truth and authoritative norms and social institutions, and that became dominant in our cultural and educational institutions throughout the Western world. The thought of 1968, as the French philosophers Alain Renaud and Luc Ferry have called it, inaugurated a bold cultural project to subvert or, my students use this word all the time now, deconstruct. You know, well, instead of examining or exegeting a text, we deconstruct it. Don't use the word unless you mean deconstruction in the real sense of the term. All authoritative cultural, political, and religious traditions in the name of an emancipated self whose only moral injunction was the imperative of authenticity. The vacuity, the emptiness of the culture of repudiation and its project of cultural and spiritual deconstruction is exemplified by the motto that dominated revolutionary discourse in Paris during May 1968. It is forbidden to forbid. There was nothing liberal about this anarchist affirmation, and there is, in truth, nothing especially conservative about exposing the stupidity and infantilism that underlays it. Alas, it is no secret that liberals displayed something less than civic courage and intellectual self-confidence in responding to the challenge of this new antinomianism, this effort to tear down authority, law. The old anti-totalitarian consensus seemed to collapse at the intellectual level, even if it continued to show a bit more vitality in the political sphere. A country like Germany, the old liberalism just collapsed. It's continued to have a certain political resonance, but intellectually the universities were colonized by the new left. Far too many liberals in both Europe and America averted their eyes from the existence of enemies on the left. That is the disease of modern liberalism. The failure to recognize liberals to the left, enemies to the left. Or you might say true liberals know that they're enemies to the left. False liberals recognize no enemies to the left. There were, of course, some admirable exceptions. One was the great French political philosopher, I will anglicize, Raymond Aron. In his later works, such as In Defense of Decadent Europe, a book that came out in 1977, and the memoirs he published before his death in 1983, Aron expressed deep forebodings about the future of a liberal Europe that was in the process of losing sight of the political virtues necessary to sustain liberal civilization. By the way, when I use the word liberal here, I'm using it in the sense of a regime and a civilization dedicated to political liberty. I'm not talking about McGovernism. I'm dating myself, along with Donnie and Marie. I used to say, when I'm using liberal here, I'm not talking about McGovernism. And McGovern's, like for my students, right back there with the ancient Han dynasty. So it's very hard, if you teach long enough, to update your political and cultural references. Liberals had forgotten that such authoritative institutions as the university, army, and church were indispensable to the moral and civic health of liberal communities. Aron spoke of a crisis of civilization and the decadence of free and prosperous peoples, bereft, or increasingly bereft, of civic spirit and martial virtue. In a book on Clausewitz, Pensée la guerre Clausewitz, he wrote ruefully of the European desire to escape altogether. This is 1976, not 2002. He wrote ruefully of the European desire to escape altogether from the demands of universal history, to proceed as if war and conflict were henceforth part of the prehistory of humankind. Aron insisted that European wishful thinking to the contrary, history would always continue to, quote, write its letters in blood. In his view, intellectuals who proclaim the obsolescence of national sovereignty, of so-called high politics, lacked a sufficient, quote, sense of history and tragedy. This is really one of the problems with the sort of Fukuyaman perspective, this tendency to treat the whole terrible 20th century from 1914 to 1918 as a parenthesis, a blip. You know, in other words, we can proceed as if it tells us nothing essential about human nature and nothing essential about the permanent place of tragedy, conflict, and tyranny in the human world. Civilized life depends on the willingness of free peoples to remain in history with a capital H and a willingness to shed blood in its defense. Aron ended this book on Clausewitz in 1976 by writing, "Future men will feel other passions, but today, how can I, as a Frenchman of Jewish origin, forget that France owes her liberation to the power of her allies, or that Israel owes her very existence to her arms, and probably owes her future survival to her willingness, and if need be, American willingness to fight again." Now, it's no accident that Aron was both the most vocal and eloquent French critic of the events of May 68 and the first important European thinker to describe and critique the massive depoliticization of contemporary Europe. Aron saw at work in those events a systematic ideological challenge to the moral foundations of liberal civilization. He understood well that respect for the dignity and liberties of human beings was the glory of Western civilization. But he also recognized that an apolitical individualism that eroded civic virtue was the enemy of liberty. I think it's fair to say, I'm sure Bart will have many more things to say on this theme, the spirit, and we don't want to overdo this, there are many voices in Europe today that are critical of the dominant ethos, this sort of spirit of depoliticization. But the spirit that dominates in what Rumsfeld disparagingly and probably imprudently called old Europe is far from Aronian. Aron was an unremitting defender of liberal democracy against totalitarian temptation. While no conservative traditionalist, he nonetheless understood that if the West was to renew itself, it must continue to draw on broader and deeper cultural and spiritual resources than those provided by modern individualism or Enlightenment rationality. A West that is true to itself and capable of concerted collective action. When Aron speaks about the depoliticization of Europe, what he really has in mind is raising the question, does Europe still have a collective capacity for action? Does it have a capacity to defend itself? Does it have a capacity to name and recognize enemies in the world? That's the political virtue par excellence, to recognize an enemy, to be able to name the enemy. And if it's going to do that, it needs to draw upon the moral inheritance of the pre-modern Western tradition, the still living attachments of many Europeans to the nation states of the continent, and the commitment to political liberty that provides the indispensable framework for individual independence. But it has long been apparent that Europeans are less and less prone to think of themselves as national peoples belonging to a common civilization called the West. Little remains of a sense of reverence toward the European past, and they no longer identify or connect democracy, as de Gaulle or Churchill did, with a millennial-old civilizational inheritance. In other words, the view of democracy is that this is a way of thinking that began a generation or two ago. That postmodern European democracy is that order that has jettisoned its reliance on that millennial-old civilizational inheritance. Instead, their loyalty is to a procedural view of democracy that in principle recognizes no territorial boundaries or binding political attachments. Europeans increasingly aspire to a post-political or post-national social state that does not depend upon or defer to the spiritual or cultural traditions of the pre-modern Western tradition. In that sense, the revolutionary spirit of 1968 has become thoroughly routinized. To challenge it is to risk being denounced as reactionary by the cultural guardians of ideological correctness.